This story was sent to us by a woman named Cassandra, who lived in a third-floor apartment in a mid-sized city in the Pacific Northwest. She asked that we keep the specific location vague, and we're honoring that request. What happened to her over the course of 3 weeks is the kind of thing that sounds manageable in pieces and genuinely frightening when you see it all together. Cassandra had lived in her building for about 2 years before any of this started. She described it as a perfectly average apartment complex. 6 floors, 2 elevators, a small parking garage underneath. The kind of place where you recognize faces but don't always know names. She felt comfortable there. She'd never had any problems. Her neighbor across the hall was a man she knew only as the guy in 312. She'd seen him maybe a dozen times in 2 years. He always had headphones in. He never made eye contact. She described him to a friend once as the quintessential don't talk to me neighbor, and she meant it as a compliment. She didn't want to talk to him either. That was fine. That was normal. The first sign that something was off came on a Tuesday morning in March. Cassandra was leaving for work around 8, and when she stepped into the hallway, she noticed a small piece of torn paper on the floor, directly in front of her door. Not in front of 312, directly in front of hers. She picked it up. It had a single word written on it in pencil. The word was, today. She stood there for a second, trying to make sense of it. Today what? She figured it had fallen out of someone's pocket. A grocery list fragment. A note. She dropped it in the trash can near the elevator and didn't give it another thought. That Friday, she came home from work and found another piece of paper in front of her door. Same torn paper. Same pencil. This one said, careful. She felt a small drop in her stomach. 2 notes, both in front of her door specifically. She looked around the hallway. Empty. She stood in front of 312 for a moment, listening. She could hear something inside. A television, maybe low and indistinct. She went into her apartment, locked the door, and told herself it was probably nothing. She decided to wait and see. She did not have to wait long. The following Monday, she came home and found that someone had been inside her apartment. Nothing was taken. She was certain of that. She went through everything. Her laptop, her jewelry, her cash, all of it exactly where she'd left it. But things had been moved, slightly. A mug had been moved from the left side of the dish rack to the right. Her couch pillow was on the wrong cushion. The blinds in her bedroom had been turned to let in more light, and she always kept them angled down for privacy. Small things. The kind of things that could make you question your own memory, if you weren't observant. But Cassandra was observant. She knew her space. Someone had been inside. She called the building manager immediately. He came up, walked through the apartment with her, and listened. He was polite but skeptical. He said there was no sign of forced entry. The lock hadn't been tampered with. He suggested she might have bumped the mug herself, or that maintenance had been inside, though he couldn't confirm a work order. He told her he'd look into it and get back to her. She never heard back. That night, she wedged a chair under the door handle and slept with her phone on the pillow beside her. The next 2 weeks were a sustained, low-grade nightmare. She found a third note. This one said, I see you when you sleep. She photographed it and called the non-emergency police line. An officer came, took her statement, looked at the photo, and told her to call back if anything escalated. He gave her a case number. She kept it in her phone. She started noticing that the man in 312 seemed to be aware of her schedule. When she left at 8, his door would open a crack, just as she stepped into the hallway. The first time, she thought it was coincidence. The second time, she stopped and looked directly at the door. The crack closed, slowly. Like whoever was on the other side had been watching, and then pulled back when they realized she'd noticed. She knocked on his door once. No answer. She knocked again. Nothing. She stood there and said, I know you're in there. The notes need to stop. Silence. Then, very quietly, a sound from just behind the door. Not words. Just a small, deliberate sound, like someone pressing their hand flat against the wood. She went back to her apartment and shook for about an hour. She told 2 friends and her sister. Her sister told her to move. One friend told her to install a camera. She did both simultaneously. The camera showed her something she hadn't expected. At 2 a.m, on the first night she had it running, the man from 312 stepped out into the hallway. He was in his regular clothes. He walked directly in front of her door and stood there for 7 minutes without moving. Then he went back inside. She had that footage and the case number. She went back to the police with both. This time, a different officer took her seriously. They ran the man's name. He had a prior restraining order from a previous address, filed by a woman who had lived across the hall from him. Same setup, same building layout. She had reported notes, a feeling of being watched. Items moved inside her apartment. The case had been closed when the woman moved away. He had done this before. Cassandra was out of her apartment within 3 weeks of that discovery. She broke her lease, paid the fee, and left. The property manager actually waived part of the penalty when she showed him the police report. On the day she was moving her final boxes out, she propped her door open to make it easier to carry things to the elevator. She heard the door to 312 open. She heard footsteps cross the hallway. She didn't look up. She kept moving boxes. She said she could feel him standing there, watching her. She finished loading the cart. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button and waited. The doors opened. She got in. As the elevator closed, she finally looked back down the hallway. He was standing in his doorway. Not in the hallway. Just in the doorway, watching her leave. And he was smiling. She said that image stayed with her for a long time after. Not because of what it meant, but because of how familiar it felt. Like he had seen this before. Like he knew exactly how it ended. And like he was already thinking about who would move in next. I never thought much about my neighbor until the night I realized he had been watching me for over a year. When I moved into the duplex on Crestwood Drive, I was 26, newly single, and just relieved to have a place of my own. It was a quiet street, old oak trees lining the sidewalk. Most of the houses had been there since the 70s. The kind of neighborhood where people mow their lawns on Saturday mornings and wave from their driveways. It felt safe. It felt like exactly what I needed. My neighbor on the left side of the duplex was a man named Gerald, mid-60s, retired, always home. The first time I met him was the day I moved in. He came out to his porch while I was carrying boxes and introduced himself. Polite enough. A little stiff, maybe. But nothing alarming. He told me he'd lived there for 19 years, and that it was a good, quiet street. I thanked him and went back to moving. Over the next few weeks, I noticed Gerald was outside a lot, not doing anything in particular, just sitting on his porch, watching the street. I figured he was bored. Retired people sometimes don't know what to do with all the time they suddenly have. I didn't think much about it. The first thing that felt slightly off happened about 2 months in. I was pulling into my driveway after work, a little after 7 in the evening, and Gerald was on his porch. He waved and said, "Running a little late tonight." I laughed it off and said, "Yeah, traffic was bad." But I remember thinking, how does he know what time I usually get home? I'd only lived there 2 months. It was a small enough comment that I filed it away and forgot about it. Then in October, about 4 months after I moved in, I had a friend visiting for the weekend. She parked her car on the street in front of the duplex. The next morning, Gerald knocked on my door. When I opened it, he said, perfectly calmly, "Your friend drives a silver Civic, doesn't she? I saw it wasn't there Thursday night. She must have arrived Friday." My friend had arrived Friday evening. I had never told Gerald anything about her. I didn't even know if he'd ever seen her car before. I smiled, said something non-committal, and closed the door. I stood in my hallway for a moment with a feeling I couldn't quite name. Not fear, exactly. More like the sense that something was slightly wrong. But I couldn't point to what. I started paying more attention after that, and what I noticed made the feeling worse. Gerald was almost always on his porch when I left in the morning. Almost always on his porch when I came home. He knew when my trash day was, which wouldn't be strange, except one evening he said, "You forgot your bin again. I put it out for you." I hadn't asked him to do that. I hadn't told him I sometimes forgot. He had just noticed, tracked it, and acted on it. One evening in November, I got home and realized I'd locked my keys inside. I called a locksmith and waited on my porch. Gerald came out and stood at the railing between our yards. He watched the whole thing. When the locksmith left, Gerald said, "I hope you find a better spot for your spare. Behind the rear tire isn't as hidden as you think." My stomach dropped. I had put a spare key behind my rear tire months ago. I'd done it once. Quietly. When I was alone in the driveway. Gerald had seen it. Gerald had remembered it. I want to be clear about something. Nothing Gerald ever said was overtly threatening. He never raised his voice. He was never rude. On the surface, every interaction looked like a mildly nosy older neighbor being friendly. But when I started writing things down, when I actually made a list of every comment and every moment, the picture that emerged was something else entirely. He knew what time I left for work each morning. He knew what time I came home. He knew which nights I stayed up late, because he'd mentioned once that my bedroom light was on past midnight. He knew when I ordered food because he'd referenced a delivery driver coming by. He knew my car's mileage had increased because he'd commented that I must be driving more lately. I had never told him any of this. None of it. He had simply watched and remembered and cataloged. I started closing my blinds. I started varying my schedule. I started using the back door when I could. Small adjustments. The kind that feel necessary before you can fully explain why. The moment everything crystallized happened in December. A coworker had asked me out and I'd said yes. It was a first date. I'd only mentioned it to 2 people, both of them at work. I came home the night before and Gerald was on the porch. He said, "Do anything fun tomorrow night?" I stopped walking. "I'm not sure yet," I said. "Why?" he shrugged. "No reason. Just thought you might have plans." I went inside and sat on my couch and tried to figure out how he could have known. I hadn't told anyone in the neighborhood. I hadn't made any calls outside. There was no logical explanation, unless he had access to something I didn't know about. I called a friend and asked if I was overreacting. She came over. I showed her my list. She went quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You need to figure out if he can hear inside your apartment." I hadn't even considered that. The duplex shared a wall. The wall between my living room and Gerald's living room. I thought about every phone call I'd made in that room, every conversation, every time I'd talked about my schedule, my plans, my dates, my work. A few days later, I had a contractor I knew come over. Under the pretense of looking at a leaky faucet, I asked him to check the shared wall. He found it in less than 20 minutes, a small hole, barely the diameter of a pencil, drilled through the drywall near the baseboard, angled toward where I usually sat on the couch. It was old. The edges were worn and painted over. Gerald had not drilled it. It had likely been there for years. But Gerald had known about it, and Gerald had used it. I moved out within 30 days. I didn't confront him. I didn't want to. I just packed, signed a lease somewhere else, and left. On my last day, Gerald came out to his porch. As I was loading the final boxes into my car, he waved. He smiled. He said it was a shame I was leaving. He said I'd been a good neighbor. I smiled back. I loaded the last box. I got in my car and drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. I still think about that hole in the wall sometimes. I think about how long it had been there. I think about how many people had lived in that apartment before me. I think about what Gerald knew about all of them. And I think about the fact that no one ever noticed until I started writing things down. Pay attention to what people know about you that you never told them. Most of the time, it's nothing. But sometimes, it's everything. There's a specific kind of fear that comes from realizing that something you thought was random was actually deliberate, that a pattern you noticed too late had been building the entire time. This story is about that exact feeling. It came to us from a man named Daniel, who lived for 3 years on a dead-end street in rural central Tennessee. He said he spent the first 2 of those years thinking his neighbor was eccentric. He spent the 3rd year understanding what eccentric had been covering for. Daniel had bought his house in his early 30s, newly married, planning ahead. His property sat at the end of a short dead-end road. 2 other houses on the road, both occupied. The house directly across from his belonged to a man named Rudy. Rudy had been there for decades. He was somewhere in his late 50s when Daniel moved in, single, worked locally doing something with equipment repair, and had what Daniel described as an intensity about him that could read as serious or unfriendly, depending on the day. The first year was ordinary. Rudy would wave from his yard. Occasionally, they'd exchange a few words about weather, property upkeep, the usual things neighbors talk about when they don't know each other well. Daniel described Rudy as one of those people who always seemed to be in the middle of a project. Tools in the driveway, something always being fixed or built. Daniel didn't pay much attention to the specifics. He just knew Rudy was always out there. What Daniel started to notice in the second year was that Rudy always seemed to be outside when Daniel was outside. If Daniel went to get the mail, Rudy was in his driveway. If Daniel came out to mow the lawn, Rudy was at the fence line. If Daniel's wife pulled in, Rudy would appear on his porch within minutes. Daniel mentioned it to his wife once. She said it was probably coincidence. The houses were close, the road was quiet, you'd naturally be aware of your neighbor's movements. Daniel agreed and moved on. Then in the fall of the second year, Daniel was installing a ceiling fan in his bedroom. He was up on a step stool, working on the wiring, and he happened to glance out the window toward Rudy's house. Rudy was standing in his own second-floor window, just standing there, not doing anything, looking directly at Daniel's house. Daniel stayed very still for a moment. He stepped down from the stool and moved to the side of the window, where he could see out without being directly in view. Rudy stayed at the window for another 2 or 3 minutes, then walked away. Daniel didn't say anything to his wife that night. He didn't want to alarm her based on something that could still reasonably be explained away, but he started paying attention in a different way after that. He noticed that Rudy's second-floor window had a direct line of sight into Daniel's living room, kitchen, and bedroom if the blinds were open. He noticed that Rudy's porch light came on every single time Daniel's car pulled in at night, without exception. Motion activated, presumably. But the angle of the light covered Daniel's driveway, better than it covered Rudy's own yard. He noticed that on the 2 occasions, when Daniel and his wife had argued loudly enough that their voices might have carried through an open window, Rudy appeared in his yard within minutes each time. Not close, not intrusively, just present, like he was listening for the shape of things. In the 3rd year, Daniel's wife became pregnant. They started discussing whether to stay in the house long-term or look for something bigger. This conversation happened mostly indoors, privately. They hadn't told anyone in the neighborhood. About 6 weeks into the pregnancy, Rudy came over for the first time. He knocked on the door, said he had something he wanted to give them. He handed Daniel a small wooden box. Inside was a hand-carved rattle. Rudy said he made it himself. He said, "Figured you'd be needing this before too long." Daniel stood at the door holding the rattle, and could not think of a single way Rudy would know his wife was pregnant. She wasn't showing yet. They hadn't told the neighbors. They hadn't told most of their family. Daniel thanked him, closed the door, and stood in his hallway trying to breathe through the tight feeling in his chest. His wife came out and asked what was wrong. He showed her the rattle. He told her what Rudy had said. She went quiet. They went through everything they could think of. Had they talked about it outside? No. Had they mentioned it to anyone locally? No. Had any deliveries or paperwork come that might have been visible? Possibly. But nothing that would have made it obvious to a neighbor. The most frightening explanation kept rising to the surface. Rudy had somehow been close enough, long enough, to see or hear something he shouldn't have had any access to. Daniel's wife wanted to call the police. Daniel said they had nothing concrete. A rattle. A comment. Nothing that would constitute a report on its own. Instead, he started documenting everything. He set up a small camera aimed at his front porch and driveway. He kept a log of every interaction with Rudy. Every time he spotted him at the window. Every time the porch light triggered when Daniel arrived home. What he found over the next 4 weeks was methodical and deeply unsettling. Rudy was at his second floor window an average of 4 times a day, always when there was visible movement in Daniel's house. The porch light had been repositioned at some point in the past year, angled slightly further toward Daniel's driveway than it had been in the original photos Daniel had taken when he first moved in. And on 2 separate nights, the camera caught Rudy walking to the edge of his property line at around midnight, standing there for several minutes, and then going back inside. Daniel went to the county sheriff's office and spoke with a deputy. The deputy listened. He looked at the photos and timestamps. He told Daniel that while it was certainly concerning, nothing Rudy had done was technically illegal. Standing in your own yard was not a crime. Having a window with a view of your neighbor's house was not a crime. Giving someone a gift was not a crime. The deputy advised Daniel to consider security measures and to call if anything escalated to a direct threat. 2 weeks later, it did. Daniel's wife was home alone on a Thursday afternoon. She had been resting and woke up to the sound of someone on the back porch. She stayed still and listened. Footsteps. Someone walking slowly across the wooden porch boards. She called Daniel first, whispering. He told her to call the police and stay in the bedroom with the door locked. She did. By the time the officers arrived, whoever had been on the porch was gone, but there were fresh boot prints in the soft dirt beside the porch steps, and the back gate to the yard, which Daniel always kept latched, was unlatched. The officers went across the road and spoke to Rudy. He was cooperative, polite. He said he'd been home all afternoon and hadn't heard anything. He seemed concerned. He said he hoped they were okay. The officers found nothing definitive, but one of them, before he left, told Daniel quietly that they'd keep an eye on things. He said the name had come up before. In a different context, in a different county, several years back. He didn't elaborate. He just said, keep your doors locked and call them immediately if it happened again. Daniel and his wife moved within 2 months. They sold the house quickly, below asking price, just to get out. On the day they left, Rudy stood in his yard the entire time they loaded the moving truck, not helping, not saying much, just watching, arms crossed. Just before Daniel got into the car for the last time, Rudy walked over to the edge of the road. He said, "Going to miss having you two around. Quiet Street's going to feel even quieter now." Daniel said, "Take care of yourself, Rudy." And then he left. He told us he's thought a lot about what Rudy knew and how he knew it. He said the most disturbing conclusion isn't that Rudy was dangerous in an obvious way. It's that Rudy was patient. That whatever Rudy was doing, he had been doing it for a long time. Carefully. Staying just on the right side of the line. Staying invisible to everyone, except the people living directly across from him. Daniel said the thing that haunts him most isn't any single moment. It's the rattle. The little carved wooden rattle that Rudy knew to make, before anyone else knew there was a reason to make it. He said he doesn't know what happened to the family that moved in after them. He said he hopes they're okay. He said sometimes he thinks about calling the county and checking. He just doesn't know what he would say. He just doesn't know what he would say.